Welcome. My name is James Green. I'm a senior research fellow here at Georgetown. Thanks to the Georgetown Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues for producing this series. This is part of their U.S.-China Dialogue Series 2020. The discussion today is an outgrowth of our podcast project called the U.S.-China Dialogue Podcast, which is available on the Georgetown University website, Apple Podcasts, and as they say, wherever you get your podcasts. In that series, we talked to over 24 former US and a handful of former Chinese officials about their experience in handling bilateral relations since the establishment of diplomatic ties in 1979. If you have questions about this during this discussion, please email them to US-China Dialogue, one word, at georgetown.edu. One of the first people that I interviewed for the podcast project was my former colleague and friend, Wendy Cutler, who's joining us today. Wendy joined the Asia Society Policy Institute as the vice president in November of 2015, and she serves as the managing director of the Washington, D.C. office. Wendy spent nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the United States Trade Representative, known as USTR, and most recently in that position, she was the acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative working on a range of U.S. trade negotiations and initiatives in the Asia Pacific, including China. She was responsible for major parts of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, or the TPP, including the bilateral negotiations with Japan. Wendy is a graduate of Georgetown, having gotten her master's with you all a couple of years ago. I've known Wendy for years, but worked most closely with her at my last position in the US government, in which I was the Minister Counselor for Trade at the United States Embassy in Beijing, 2013 to 2018. So through the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. And before that, I had 15 years of experience in the United States government working and in the private sector, working mostly on China and the Asia Pacific. So with all that intro, let's get to the meat. Candidate Donald Trump ran for president in 2016 largely on 2 issues, immigration and trade, mostly against both of those. On trade, his principal fire was aimed at the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and China, both described as unfair towards American workers and companies. 4 years after the 2016 election, we do indeed have a new NAFTA agreement, known now as USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and a new trade agreement with China. The person who has made both of those happen is veteran trade lawyer Bob Lighthizer, who was confirmed by the Senate and sworn in as the United States Trade Representative in June 2017. Ambassador Lighthizer had for a decade publicly warned about the dangers of letting China into the World Trade Organization, or WTO, back in December 2001. In his view, the WTO was and is ill-equipped to deal with large trading nation like China that has a sizable state sector and a mercantilist policies which distort prices and global markets. So soon after taking office, Lighthizer reached back into the law books to begin an investigation on China's forced technology transfer policies under the Section 301 part of the Trade Act of 1974. That led to a series of tariffs in 2018, counter tariffs from China, prolonged negotiation, and a truce agreement of sorts in January 2020. So that brings us to today. I wonder, Wendy, I gave a very kind of cursory overview of the trade drama. Could you just say where you see things today in U.S.-China trade in terms of conflict, and set the table for us to look forward to 2021?
Sure, James. But before I do that, let me just say what a delight it is for me to join you today for this panel. And I really would like to put a plug in for your podcast series. It is just an amazing group of interviews with kind of the legends, the movers and shakers in US-China policy through the years. I had the great opportunity during the first few months of the COVID lockdown to listen to a lot of podcasts, and I actually listened to the whole series. And so anyone who's interested in this topic, this is such a treasure of interviews, and you did an amazing job. And frankly, I think this is going to be just a lasting contribution to the understanding of US-China relations. So with that, let me get to your question. excuse me, you use the word truce. And the way I look at things right now, I think we have what I would call just a fragile truce, very fragile on the US China trade front. We have a phase one agreement in place. This agreement amazingly locks in hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs between both sides. It includes many chapters on, excuse me. It includes many chapters on rules, but it also now the focus just seems to be all about agriculture purchases. And so it's hard to say that this agreement really achieved the objectives that the Trump administration initially sought out to accomplish in this negotiation. And it's also hard to see how this phase one agreement will be followed by a phase two agreement should President Trump win. There's so much distrust and tension between the two governments, kind of in all aspects of the relationship. And in some kind of crazy way, the trade relationship now is probably a bit more stable than the other parts of the relationship, but I think it's extremely fragile.
Wendy, thank you. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, you had mentioned a kind of tariffs, tit for tat, and then a trade kind of pause, a fragile one. Why do countries do things like phase one and phase two and phase three? And why was it done in this case?
Look, I wasn't at the negotiating table, but what I suspect, having negotiated many agreements, they're trade negotiations are exhausting. And I can only imagine this high profile negotiation must have been exhausting, even more exhausting than others, with all of the international attention paid to it and given how high the stakes were. And so you get to a point in negotiations where you kind of are faced with a decision: do you keep going on and try and get everything, or are you better off just to pocket what you've already gotten, try and put that into place, get some momentum, and then move on to the more difficult issues? But the danger is, and this is what we've seen, is that this phase one has not been followed by a phase two. And what's of just grave concern is that many of the key issues, such as subsidies or state-owned enterprises or cybersecurity, these issues were all delayed to phase two. And these are kind of the crux of the issues that need to be resolved if indeed we're going to have a level playing field with China.
Yeah, I wanted to get your take, since you've had a lot of experience. You were the lead negotiator for our Korea FTA, which at the time was the kind of foremost agreement with any country. And then you were a major participant in particularly working with Japan in the TPP negotiations. Could you just talk a little bit about how those sorts of negotiations compared to negotiations with China? That is, you were involved with China negotiations, not in this administration, but in the previous ones.
Yeah.
How do those different negotiations compare to what's happening with China?
You know, I look at the early negotiations with Japan that I was involved in the late 80s and the early 90s. And those, I think, were more akin to the China talks, in that Japan didn't want to be at the negotiating table with us, and China sure didn't want to be with the negotiating table with us. Both of them viewed what we were asking was very one-sided. They didn't want to make concessions. They didn't see what they were going to get out of them, and they feared they'd just be criticized at home for giving too much to the United States. But the TPP negotiations with Japan and the Korean negotiations were very different, because in both of those negotiations, those partners wanted to be at the negotiating table. They wanted to conclude an FTA or the TPP with us. So we had a shared objective. It by no means meant that they were easy negotiations. They were very tough, but the overall tone of the negotiations and having a shared objective just made them dramatically different than the China phase one talks. I would also just say that I found negotiating with the Chinese to be a bit of a black box for me. It was very difficult to develop the types of relationships with my counterparts that I could with other countries where you could go out to eat with them, you'd travel more. It was okay to socialize and to get to know them better. That was one, key difference. But I also felt with the Chinese, a lot of times you felt it was very kind of top down, that they got their instructions for that meeting, they kept repeating it, and until they got new instructions, then they were very hesitant to informally explore any type of possible resolutions or solutions. And I think that dynamic has even gotten more apparent since I've left USTR under the tight leadership and control of Xi Jinping.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should say that I was involved in the beginning part of these negotiations with China for the phase one trade agreement. And I was the person that went to the Ministry of Commerce and explained to them that indeed we were going to be putting tariffs on their goods under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. And I think your assessment of where the very tight leash that Chinese trade negotiators have has only gotten tighter, as you say. And I do think, it's not a function only of the trade discussions, but also diplomatic negotiations in which Chinese diplomats just aren't given much latitude. And some of it is the kind of way that the Communist Party manages governance. And some of it is cautiousness on the part of Chinese bureaucrats. You don't get ahead by being entrepreneurial and putting ideas forward. So I think that really limits what can happen. On the upside, I would just say my experience is because the United States is so important to China, you can oftentimes get an answer quite quickly on some things. That talking to counterparts from Australia or Korea, and when they negotiate with China, oftentimes they wait for a long time to get an answer. Whereas, the United States is just at the forefront of where most Chinese leaders are thinking about things. And so even if the answer was no, at least we could have some process and we had
It was
some
a quick
access.
no.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think we, although as you say, it's not easy to negotiate with the Chinese, at least it's a priority. For other countries, it's not even a priority to kind of get to engage with, shall we say, smaller economies. And so their questions just hang out there and they never get an answer back.
Yeah, it's got to be extremely frustrating.
And yes, and on your point about socializing, I think in a lot of ways, you see an enhanced Chinese diplomacy, this kind of wolf warrior diplomat now that's quite aggressive. I think that does China an ill service. And because you don't have that soft tissue of actually knowing people in a personal way, you don't give them a lot of slack. And so that the Chinese profile is just very brittle. And you don't have that kind of soft affinity that you might have with other more open societies.
Yeah, and I found negotiating with other countries, it was after those formal sessions, if you could go out to dinner with them and just have an informal talk, you discuss things in a much more casual manner, and your ability to explore, to find solutions, or to just kind of let your hair down a little and talk more frankly. I think that's so important to finding that common ground. And it just was difficult again. And I saw over the years, I think you would agree, it became even more and more difficult as the leash got tighter.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a friend of mine, and then I'll get to kind of where things are going forward, who, when I was at the US Embassy in the late 1990s, and we were negotiating China's entry into the WTO, and she had the trade portfolio. And at that time, the Ministry of Commerce had a housing complex, and so almost all the officials were living there together as neighbors, not in a communal living, but that is,
Right.
Your apartment would be next to your boss's apartment, which is always a challenge for living and working together. But at that time, this colleague of mine from the embassy would go over and kind of see her counterparts at the Ministry of Commerce and hang out in their apartment, and it was just much less restricted in terms of how they were interacting with American officials. And that allowed, in some ways, for her to gather information about what the Chinese side was really thinking. And that led to the bilateral breakthrough for US-China WTO accession package, and then the plurilateral one to allow China into the WTO. Looking forward, I think we're both agreeing that there's a lot of conflict around tariffs and trade. The tariff part of the U.S.-China trade friction is one part. Before looking kind of ahead to January 2021 and the issues going forward for U.S.-China and the WTO, Could you just touch on how that plays with the broader kind of US-China conflict on technology and other areas? I mean, those are not, strictly speaking, tariff issues, but they're part of this broader conflict between the two countries. And how do you see that interplay?
Exactly. I mean, you can't just cabin trade off and just say, oh, we're going to, go ahead and trade and think, and that's that part of the relationship. We're going to, be friends, or we're going to try and, work together. It's also interrelated with other aspects of the relationship. And I think we really saw that during the phase one negotiations. I mean, announcements were made on Huawei during the negotiations, even though I know Ambassador Lighthizer probably insisted that Huawei was not his issue and he wouldn't talk about it. But I seem to recall that when the CFO of Huawei was actually detained in Canada, that was like during the same during the G20 meeting when Trump was meeting with Xi Jinping. So all of this stuff is a lot's going on in the relationship at the same time. And events like that can really affect a trade negotiation. And even if you try to explain to the other side that you didn't know these things were happening, they don't believe that. They think it's all part of your strategy to get a negotiating advantage. Now, to be honest, sometimes it is. But frankly, I've been in many negotiations where kind of roll with it. I didn't know about what was going to happening elsewhere. And while the other side was crediting me with some kind of great negotiating strategy, it was just, this is how things were just falling. And we're a big government, a lot goes on. And particularly now with China, you have so many different government agencies. It almost seems they have a free pass to just do anything against China that again, like that will be welcome and they'll be applauded. So trying to take all this different actions and trying to coordinate it in a strategy is something I just haven't seen over the past couple of years in this administration.
Yeah, and then I think that issue is accelerated by social media. I mean, I'm not dating you to say when you started negotiating with Japan, there was no Twitter, and so
Well,
you'd have to look at the newspaper, and that could drive your agenda if something hit the press or a television program. But it was not this kind of real time of you're in the
right, where you're
negotiating
sitting in a
room
negotiation, just
and
reading
the
your
president's
phone and
tweeted
just
something, right?
yeah, and your eyes are rolling and you're just hoping the other side isn't doing this. They're not reading the same thing you are, right? You just want to
Right,
get out of
exactly.
that room and end that session.
But before looking forward, I just wanted to, you had mentioned things, and we talked about forced technology transfer and some of the real issues that the administration had laid out as phase two parts. That is, some of the structural issues in the Chinese economy that make it quite different from the US economy and some other Western economies. How does, at a kind of very high level, how do trade agreements address things like state enterprises or forced technology transfer? Can you actually get that sort of language and commitment in a trade agreement? And if so, how do you do that?
And that's a great question. And I'll just refer to the TPP negotiations, where we did have a chapter on state-owned enterprises, which incidentally lived basically untouched in the CPTPP, which is now in place between 7 other countries. And the key was in state-owned enterprises. The operating principle wasn't you can't have any state-owned enterprises. That no one was going to agree to that, including the United States. Okay, so then the question is, how can you write rules that allow state-owned enterprises to exist and to do their business, but at the same time create a level playing field if these state-owned enterprises get into the commercial space and are doing business when they're competing against private companies of other countries. And though that's how you start. You need to define what you're trying to get at. You need to focus on the trade distortions. And then furthermore, in that chapter, we had actually, each country was allowed to negotiate exceptions to the rules. So we had high level rules, but we recognized that certain countries like Vietnam, for example, they couldn't agree to all these rules for all their state-owned enterprises overnight. So they negotiated for what we call transition periods. So maybe with respect to this big state-owned enterprise, within 5 years, they agreed they would live up to those rules. And from a trade negotiator's point of view, that's okay, particularly for countries that are at a lower level of development. So there are lots of skills and tricks and models that trade negotiators use. But I think the key is if you come in and you say, we just want to get rid of all your state subsidies and get rid of your state-owned enterprises, there's no basis for a negotiation. You need to think about how you can eliminate the trade distortions, create a level playing field, create transparency, non-discrimination, and again, do it in a way that the other side is willing to negotiate with you.
I want to give a shout out to your great report that just came out on the TPP and what the options are for the US to potentially rejoin it. That's the Asia Society Policy Institute that you guys put it out 2-3 weeks ago.
You know, every week in the COVID world seems like a year.
5 months ago. Yeah, really quite good. And what, as we've talked about before, what I found particularly useful is here's what Asian countries who are in the CPTPP, the new name for the TPP, here's what they think about the US rejoining, which is not to steal your thunder, but basically, yes, they welcome the United States, but they're not going to throw away what they've worked on already to have the United States join.
Yeah, I think a lot of times in the US, we get so lost in what we want. And particularly in this instance, if we were going to think about returning to some kind of TPP type agreement with the TPP countries, they have an agreement in place. So basically, their opinion is extremely important. And the danger is that we get lost in what we want. And from what I learned in interviewing officials, current and former officials, in writing this paper, is that at a very high level, they welcome the United States back into TPP, CPTPP. They want us back. But when you start going into details and what's their bandwidth for changes the US would want to make, then the country's got a bit more skittish and wary. And a number of them pointed out to me, it's a different world now than it was 5 years ago for us. We brought this an agreement in without you. And frankly, we made a lot of political decisions and embraced a lot of your earlier proposals, took a big political hit. And, we're a little worried and skittish about going through this again with you if you were going to come in and want to kind of, do a major renegotiation. So my conclusion is that maybe over time, we could look at coming back if we were really targeted and specific with what more we would need. But I think in the immediate term, what might make more sense is to try and work with these countries on a more limited negotiation, a narrower negotiation, whether it be digital trade or medical supply chain trade or climate change and trade, but try and kind of build the trust and momentum with something smaller.
Let's, yeah, thank you. Again, it's a really great report. Looking ahead for January 2021, can you just talk about what you see as the major issues facing the US and China, and as well as the WTO? The WTO seems incredibly stuck, both the dispute resolution as well as the negotiation part of the WTO. How is all that big ball of challenge? How do you see kind of untangling some of it, or where do you see areas for progress, or where we're not going to make any progress?
Yeah. So
Starting next year.
Yeah, I mean, trade has become, let's just say, a very difficult issue, both with respect to not only US domestic concerns and concerns from a population and many citizens in the United States who feel they haven't shared in the benefits of these trade agreements and almost see that these trade agreements have exacerbated income inequalities. And now with COVID and our economic recession, it's hard to see how we would overnight kind of gain the support we would need to go back to the world and do big trade agreements again. But there's a lot of challenges, not only on the domestic front, but internationally. part of our challenge again is that a lot of countries, while we kind of retreated and when tried to proceed just with bilateral negotiations, other countries have been proceeding with free trade agreements among themselves, giving preferences to each other, which basically work to the disadvantage of US exporters. Just next month, 15 Asian countries are going to sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Negotiate Agreement, RCEP, which granted, doesn't have as high standards and isn't as comprehensive as the CPTPP, but nevertheless, it's an economic integration agreement between 15 Asian countries, and we're on the outside. And you look at the European Union, they just put their deal with Vietnam into place. They're negotiating with Australia, with New Zealand, with other Asian countries, and other negotiations are proceeding as well. So it's a very different world that, frankly, they've kind of learned to work without us, and they've kind of built that confidence. So, and let's be honest, our market isn't as let's just say proportionally doesn't represent the same heft that it used to. For many countries in Asia, almost all of them, China by far is their largest trading partner. And let's remember, coming out of COVID, China's economy is growing now. And so not only is it a big and dynamic economy before COVID, but when you look at opportunities, that's where countries are looking. And then when you look to the World Trade Organization, which is the international organization governing, global trade, it's in a crisis. And its functions of dispute settlement, its ability to deliver on negotiations and modernize its rules and deal with the US-China trade tensions is not going well. And so I think the WTO going forward is either going to have to step up to these challenges or, frankly, become less and less relevant. And countries will look elsewhere to settle their disputes. And they'll also look elsewhere to negotiate new rules. Negotiating with 164 countries is, and with all different levels of development, is extremely difficult, even under the best of circumstances. But now with COVID, a global economic recession, and a lot of countries questioning whether globalization is even in their interests or has just frankly worked against their economic interests. Those are all the considerations that are going to need to be factored into any trade policy going forward.
And if you look at the landscape, I mean, we're always focused, having both worked in the executive branch for many years, on the presidential race. But in some ways, what happens on US trade policy is what happens in the Congress, because of the Trade Promotion Authority, because an FTA, a free trade agreement, has to be approved by Congress. How do you see the Congress, say the next Congress starting also in January 2021, how are they looking at trade? There was a successful renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, as I'd mentioned, and that then passed both houses of Congress. How do you see Congress playing in on this issue, both of US-China trade and the tensions there, but then also this broader issue of the World Trade Organization and the US participation in it?
I think we're going to see a much more active role for Congress in trade going forward for a number of reasons. I think that the constituents are more and more interested in their ability to trade with other countries, and from a good perspective too. Like many farmers, they want these trade agreements because they need to export all of their produce. And so they will be pushing their representatives to do more on trade and to open up markets and to make sure we're not losing out from not being in trade agreements. So it could be positive. So that's one angle. Second, I think there is concern among many in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, that President Trump and his administration really hasn't followed the trade rules, that they haven't consulted with Congress, and they frankly have abused the use of US trade laws, using them to accomplish things they were never designed to accomplish. And here I would just underscore Section 232 on the actions the administration took both with respect to steel and aluminum imports but also threatened auto and auto part tariffs on national security grounds against allies and partners. So I think that has caused concern in Congress. And frankly, when it comes to China, my understanding is in this Congress, and it's not over yet, over 350 China-related bills have been introduced in Congress by Democrats and Republicans. And I think we're going to see more and more of those bills in the next Congress, and that's going to tie the hands of whoever is in the White House, frankly.
Right. And to your point, I mean, while trade negotiators often try to see their discussion in a narrow lane, in reality, the other bilateral or plurilateral or multilateral relationships matter. So if the United States is cracking down on Chinese actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, for example, and a lot of the bills that you mentioned in Congress have to do with the Chinese crackdown in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and those bills will probably become law. Some of them already have, the Uyghur Human Rights Act of 2019. That will affect how willing the Chinese side is to sit down and talk about these market access or trade issues. And so it's hard to kind of separate those out, particularly when they're so high profile. I think with, say, smaller economies or less contentious ones, maybe you can have your political discussion or your military discussion and trade discussion. But with China, there's just so many different aspects of it that are thrown together. Which brings me to this question. National security has been invoked a number of times. You had mentioned these 232 tariffs. Those are the tariffs that the administration had imposed on the importation of steel and aluminum, allegedly for harming U.S. national security, and as you said, had threatened to do so for autos. I wanted to kind of broaden out a little bit. The U.S. has said on Huawei and parts of ZTE, these are kind of national security concerns. How do trade agreements address national security in that part of a negotiation? Much of what the administration has done on Huawei, for example, is not a kind of trade negotiation, but how do trade negotiations deal with national security, broadly speaking?
So almost all trade agreements will have an exception for national security, and that makes sense. And in the WTO, there is one. But the operating principle behind kind of the unspoken deal you have with your trading partners is you only use that exception in very limited cases that really go to the core of national security. And you almost share that common view, because once one country starts to liberally use that exception, then others can follow. So for example, what's to stop a country from saying, you know what, we need to impose tariffs against food imports because food security is very important to us. And in our country, food security is national security. You can just see the slippery slope as that definition expands and countries use this exception more and more. The United States, again, we have used it. We are being sued in the WTO for using this exception. We'll have to see how panels deliberate and what their findings are. I suspect we're not going to be happy with what they decide, but let's see. And we have seen certain other countries now aggressively use this exception to justify restrictions. Japan has done this in the measures it took against certain Korean imports. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the danger. And so once you start unraveling kind of this unspoken agreement, then the gloves are off. But, one thing I just need to underscore too is that China's hands are not clean here either. In fact, I remember in my early negotiations with China, they were using the national security exception for restrictions, broad restrictions on internet usage and internet access. And so, they started using this exception pretty liberally as well. So again, I don't think, the fault lies on Trump's door for this, but I think people always depended on the United States for being the leaders here. And so they looked to us to kind of keep the order. And when it became clear we weren't going to be not only were we not going to be leading, but we were going to be kind of going back on a lot of the measures and leadership and actions we took or didn't take, I think that was eye-opening for other countries.
Yeah, and in some ways, it kind of gave them permission to do something similar. I think in the Chinese case, they at the negotiating table would invoke national security, but they often wouldn't do it at the WTO or in a kind of more formalized legal setting because they wanted to preserve that flexibility. I think with the administration's use of these 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, I think that other countries feel like, well, the gloves are off. If the US can claim national security for cars, then we can claim it and use it. And as you say, it is a slippery slope. Once someone says that cars are national security, then it's food, it's telecommunications
Clothes,
networks.
right?
Yeah, it's right. It's clothing. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
I wonder if kind of looking forward, if you could say what will you be watching in, say, January till June of 2021 for how US-China trade is going or not going, or what's the direction? What are the sorts of things that you will be looking at to assess what the year will hold?
Yeah, and I think a lot will depend on actually who wins next week. I think in a Trump administration, we're going to see active efforts towards further decoupling of our economies, a real push for more reshoring, for our companies to leave China, not only to go to other parts of Asia, but to come back to the United States, particularly in some essential and strategic industries. And the administration seems that it will be continue to commit to the phase one deal, and there's a possibility that they would proceed with a phase two deal after the election, but I'm not sure of that. I think that in many ways, the bandwidth and desire to negotiate with the Chinese, or the Chinese desire to negotiate with the United States, I don't think there's a lot of warm feelings there or trust. So I just see relations deteriorating further and further. Under a Biden administration, I mean, I would expect that tensions are still going to permeate our relationship, but I think there'll be some important differences just based on comments that his team and the vice president have made. I think there'll be a more concerted effort, for example, to work more closely with allies and partners and present a collective and united front to China. I think there's going to be we're going to get away from this unpredictability and chaos in our trade policy and other policies, including towards China, and see a more deliberate interagency policy process. And why do I say that's important? Because I think many actions that this administration has taken, they just announce something, they don't do their homework, they're either sued in court or it's left to the bureaucrats to figure out how to impose what they're doing. And it leads to very sloppy, I would argue, decision making with a lot of unintended consequences. I don't think the administration, for example, was particularly prepared for Chinese pushback with respect to imposing its own tariffs on imports from the United States. I think the administration expected that they would threaten $50 billion worth of tariffs against China, and China would capitulate. Well, anyone who worked with them probably could have told the president that there's a good chance China's going to counter retaliate. And guess what? They're going to counter retaliate in agriculture. And in many ways, I just think the administration, they weren't ready for that. They didn't think that would happen. And if you had a real interagency policy process, I think considerations like that would have made it to the forefront. So I think those are two important differences. I also think under a Biden administration, you'll see a real strategy, an overall strategy affecting all parts of our relations with China. Trade will be one part of it, but it will be actions taken on trade or technology or people to people or on the consulate issues. It will all be kind of intertwined and integrated and followed in a very deliberate, strategic way. So those are a few important differences, but I would just underscore again that we need to get ready for a world of a lot of tensions between the United States and China. if I can just make one more comment, the Biden administration, I think they have also made clear that even though they will compete with China and confront China when China's not doing the right thing, they've also made it clear that there are areas where collaboration will be needed, right? Particularly with respect to global problems. We can't solve them on our own. So whether it be the pandemic or vaccines or climate change issues, we will need to find ways to collaborate with China. That doesn't mean we need to make trade-offs in other areas. And it doesn't mean we need to be best friends in other areas, but to turn off all the communication and collaboration because you don't like China. I mean, sorry, the world is what it is. We're the two major powers. And it seems to me that, we're going to need to figure out a way, not only just to confront and compete, but also find areas of collaboration.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, as someone who's worked in both the Washington side and the Beijing side, it is striking just how few official discussions are going on these days. To your point, one of the only really channel left is the trade channel to talk, and almost all of the other kind of diplomatic channels have fallen away or been destroyed. And to your
yeah, and I'll be
go
the
ahead.
first to admit that many of those big dialogues we had, they became less and less useful over
Not
time.
so
So I'm
productive.
not advocating we go back to that world, but communication, I think, is a good thing, not only to see if they're overlapping interests, but to warn each other of things that are happening and to express to each other where your red lines are. And to see, are there areas where we have common interests?
Right. And to your point about the chaotic decision making, I think one of the stellar examples is the two executive orders on WeChat and TikTok. Those were of kind of legal, questionable legal basis. And now both of them challenged in court, not surprisingly, and both of them are suspended. And, I think my own personal view is, sure, the United States should have some mechanism to review pernicious apps and software that might undermine our networks. I think broadly speaking, yes. But the way to do it is to not write an executive order and slapdash it out and give companies a couple of weeks to do this. I mean, that's just doesn't inspire confidence for companies and citizens who use these things every day. It's not a process that will result in a good outcome.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Couldn't agree more.
we've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to just draw on our conversation in the podcast about women in trade, which is something I know you've done a lot at the Asia Society and also in your career. And I would just say, as a starting point, it is remarkable that in U.S. foreign policy and defense circles, there aren't that many senior women that have kind of risen up to either head an agency or to be senior officials in that agency. And trade is an area that's happened. That is, there's been a number of women USTRs, that is, heads of the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and senior people like yourself have risen up through the ranks. Why do you think that is? That trade is an area that has gotten a fair number of senior women in it, and what does that say about, and how does that compare to kind of counterparts in other countries, and how is that at the negotiating table?
Yeah. So, I've been in many discussions with many former and current USTR folks about why trade seems to attract a lot of women. As you mentioned, let's just say the 9 USTRs I worked for, the last one was Ambassador Froman, 3 of them were women. And, again, there were many senior women underneath them. It wasn't just a fluke that they were at the top of the agency. I think it's an area that draws women in because to negotiate trade agreements, it's an area where you need to really listen to other people, to try and build consensus, to problem solve, to multitask. And I think women are really good at those things, but I don't think there's one answer. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in this whole issue of trying to mentor women from Asia in the trade space is that They don't have a lot of mentors. You know, most of my career, you looked across the table and guess what? They were all men across the table for the most part. And women, younger women would come up to me. Sometimes they would be in what we call the back bench in these rooms, meaning all the senior guys would be at the table and the junior people would be behind them. And some of these young women would come up to me and just say, we are just, you know, so impressed with you. And you know, I'm not here to toot my own horn, but to say that the fact that the United States would send a woman to lead a delegation on such an important issue, you must be, you know, like amazing or whatever. But through that, I recognized that, you know, there was just a real hunger for that mentorship, for trying to figure out how to get ahead in the workplace, how to deal with discrimination, how to navigate through a world that's really dominated, you know, by men for the most part. So it's a project I'm working on. I brought a group of Korean women over to the United States last year. Once we start traveling in COVID again, I'm going to be doing this with other Asian countries. And I really look forward to that. In my view, it's kind of like giving back a bit. And I would say also, if there are any American women listening, I try and reach out to American women as well, talking to universities and doing a lot of these kind of panels on women and trying to give advice. And, you know, one of the key pieces of advice I give to the younger women in Asia, but also in the United States, one of the questions I always get is, how do you achieve a work-life balance, particularly in a job where you have to travel so much? Like, it's, you know, how do you do that? And my answer is, no one does a good job at that. No one does. And men too. You have to, you know, and, you know, there's some days where your family's disappointed in you. There are other days when your colleagues at work are disappointed in you. And once you accept that you can't be perfect and you're not, there's no magic answer to this question, I think it takes a lot of pressure off people when they realize that senior level women face these dilemmas every day. I remember being in trade negotiations, you know, getting a call from my son's nurse, right? You know, your son's in the, you know, in the infirmary. Can you come pick him up? Like, what are they talking about? I'm here negotiating a trade agreement. So
In Tokyo, right?
right, right. So, you know, you just kind of have to be resourceful and figure out how, you know, how you're going, who you can rely on to help you out there, basically. Yeah, challenging, but it's doable.
Yeah, as I said, it is really remarkable, just having worked in a bunch of different agencies, that there is when you look around the table at USTR, you know, half the people there, if not more, are women. And at state or at the National Security Council or other agencies I've worked for, at the U.S. Embassy, you just really don't see that. So it is something that's noticeable, and particularly, as you said, the prominence of women at senior positions. It's not just the note takers or the people who are doing supporting; they're actually leading the negotiations. And so,
Yeah.
USTR really should be commended for that. And part of it is, I mean, you know this well, but for folks who are watching who don't, USTR is a small agency, you know, 300 people. You know, so it is quite collegial, and people get to know each other, and it has offered an opportunity for people who can produce to rise up, and it's only really for rather elite folks. That is, it doesn't have a lot of entry level positions, and so it gets the best of the best, and
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word elite. I'm just saying, like, experienced, I would say.
experience. Yes,
But I
yeah,
would also just caution you here, because I think the current administration has reversed a lot of this at USTR. If you look at Ambassador Lighthizer and you look at his circle of deputies and other senior advisors, um, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there are any women. So I think we've taken a big step back. So I hope that's something that's just changed at USTR, but I hope we see more diversity again throughout the whole government, like we've seen in previous Republican and Democratic administrations.
yes, fair point. Yes, I can't think of anyone else at the senior level under Ambassador Lighthizer who is a woman. Now that you
I mean, there's a
mentioned it.
stunning photo of phase one negotiations. I think it was taken in China with both teams. And the only woman I remember seeing is your colleague from the embassy in Beijing,
But
and about
that's a good
40
point.
men.
Yeah. Well, Wendy, thank you so much for taking this time today. We're at our we're a little bit past our cutoff time. I want to thank Georgetown for the entire podcast project, US-China Dialogue podcast. I want to thank them for allowing us to continue the discussion today on US-China trade. These issues are not going away, as you said, and they will keep us engaged for weeks and months and years to come. We'll all be watching the presidential and congressional races with interest, not only here in the US, but certainly around the world. So look forward to staying in touch, Wendy. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. It's been my honor to join you all.